Hey everyone, in this video I want to look at accessing Active Directory domain services resources from an Azure AD-joined machine without having to mess around with hybrid join or entering extra sets of credentials. Something that's actually super useful as we move into this more cloud-first world. But hey, sometimes I still want to be able to access those on-premises or at least AD-joined resources, maybe a server share, a printer, some Windows integrated authenticating application. As always, this is useful. A like and subscribe is appreciated. So if we think about today's modern management for desktops, I can think, well, I have my machine, and instead of joining it to that old Active Directory domain services, what we really think about is modern management. So at the top of this, we have our Azure Active Directory instance. And we join our machine to that Azure AD. So I am actually joined to the Azure AD instance. So now I have an object in the Azure AD. Now to complete that management picture, we add things like an MDM solution. So this could be Microsoft Endpoint Management that uses Intune in the cloud. For patching, it might be things like, well, Windows Update for Business or the new Windows Auto Patch solution. We have things like enterprise state roaming for a consistent experience. So we're not using group policy objects or any of those things. We're using these all cloud-first technologies. And this is fantastic. And what this gives me is when my machine, when I actually now go and join that to the Azure AD, when I go and authenticate, when I go through the authentication process, what actually happens is, hey, we send that authentication to our Azure AD. And what we get back is a primary refresh token that is stored securely on our machine, and I can then use it to go and get access tokens for other services. And also we get an identity token. So these are sent back as part of that authentication with Azure AD. Now that primary refresh token is leveraged by that Cloud AP plugin on our machine, and it gives us single sign-on to any resource that trusts our instance of Azure AD. So if I think about for a second, all those other software as a service could be Azure itself, Office 365, etc. But I have all of these software as a service or maybe PaaS services, they trust our Azure AD. And through this primary refresh token, when I want to go and talk to those, I get single sign-on. I don't have to re-enter credentials. I'm leveraging this to go and talk to anything that trusts my instance of Azure AD. So I get this fantastic, seamless experience. So that's awesome. However, what about if I do still have some on-premises resources? There's some file server. Maybe I have a point-to-site VPN connection. Sometimes I take my Azure AD-joined machine with my laptop and I take it to a corporate office. So I have connectivity through the network, through a point-to-site, through a site-to-site VPN to these corporate resources. Well, these corporate resources, they're not Azure AD-joined. I have my Active Directory domain services and they're joined to that. They trust this. Well, I want to be able to access it. When I have a line of sight to these AD-joined resources, how do I access those? Do I have to do now a hybrid join, really taking a step back from that cloud-first world? Well, no, I don't. The reality is, I have, for example, my user account. Typically comes from my Active Directory. And what is actually happening behind the scenes is we have this idea of Azure AD Connect. And it could also be the Cloud Sync version where the engine runs in the cloud and I have these lightweight little components that run on the domain controllers. And this is responsible for replicating objects from our Active Directory domain services, our on-prem Active Directory. And I say on-prem, it doesn't actually have to be on-prem. These could be virtual machines sitting in a virtual network in Azure or another cloud. But it's this more traditional Active Directory domain services, and it's synchronizing those accounts into my Azure AD. Now it creates me a cloud version of the account, and that's what I'm authenticating as, but it's synchronized from its on-premises equivalent. Now, as part of this synchronization, this Azure AD Connect is actually sending some other attributes about my Active Directory domain services. So some of the key things it's actually sending is this idea of a SAM account name. It's sending the NetBIOS domain name, and it's sending the DNS domain name. So it's giving information to Azure AD, well, actually about my Active Directory domain services environment. And this collection of information, if I kind of make it available as this is actually sent back as part of this identity token. So those values, that same data that Azure AD Connect told, AD told Azure AD via Azure AD Connect, those attributes are part of the identity token that gets sent back to me, that get back to my local machine. Well, this local machine, with that knowledge, what I have on here is I have my local security authority, the LSA. Now that LSA, when I do that authentication to Azure AD and I get the primary refresh token back, and then I get this identity token, well, that local security authority on the device, along with the Kerberos authentication provider, says, oh, I've got these interesting bits of information. I've got this SAM account name, the NetBIOS domain name, and the DNS domain name. Can I find a domain controller for this information? Because remember, I have the user's credentials. If I was using Windows Hello for Business, I can use the PK init that I had as part of that. So what will actually happen here, as part of this, the LSA will be like, can I find a DC? So it's going to go along and it's going to do a few things. Well, I need to find a DC via DNS. I know the DNS domain name. I'm then going to go and query DNS for the various service locator records. So the first thing I need for this to work is we talked about, hey, maybe I'm taken my machine, I've put it on my work network, or I have a point-to-site VPN or a site-to-site VPN. I need DNS resolution to my domain records. So whatever network I'm on, it has to be able to have that resolution. So that's kind of a point one that I require for that. And again, it could be I've moved it into the corp network, I have a point-to-site VPN connection, whatever that is, I have to be able to have DNS resolution. And then if you can find the domain controller, hey, it's going to go and do the auth. It's going to go and do that authentication. And then what this will generate for me, assuming that authentication is successful. So assuming I can find a domain controller, and then assuming I have line of sight to a domain controller, so two things. I have to be able to get the DNS resolution, and I have to have line of sight, i.e. a communication path. Again, I'm on the network, I've got a point to site, I've got a site to site. I have some way to communicate to a DC that I found through the DNS service record lookup. If I then have that successful authentication, it's going to generate me a Kerberos ticket granting ticket and send that back. Well, at this point, that's huge. So even though my machine is not AD joined, my user was synchronized from on-premises to my Azure AD, because as part of the identity token, Azure AD sent me back, I can now know the details of what the on-premises Active Directory domain service environment is. I'll try and find somewhere I can authenticate to and perform the authentication. Now, an important point, it's the user that is authenticating to Active Directory domain services, not the machine. The machine is not joined to AD. The machine has no account in AD. So this is going to work fantastic for services like an SMB file share, a printer. It's using Windows integrated authentication that authenticates the user. If it requires the machine to be known and the machine to authenticate, this is not going to work. So it's only for the user. But what this is now going to get me is anything that is trusting and using Windows integrated authentication to my AD, I'm going to get single sign-on to that as well without doing anything. All I did was authenticate to Azure AD. That gets me the primary refresh token, gets me single sign-on to any cloud apps that trust my Azure AD. In parallel, because I have line of sight for this particular instance in time, hey, I'm on the Corp network, I'm site-to-site or point-site VPN, because I have line of sight, it's also going to take that same credential, or PKInit if it's Hello for Business, and try and find a domain controller and authenticate and get me a Kerberos ticket granting ticket as well, which I can then exchange. So once I've got that ticket granting ticket, I can use that for ongoing communication to my domain controllers to exchange it for Kerberos service tickets to go and talk to an SMB file share, to go and talk to some website that integrates with AD, to talk to some client app that uses Windows integrated authentication. I'm not doing anything special, it's just gonna work. And that's it. I didn't actually have to do anything. It's the Azure AD Connect is synchronizing those, it's synchronizing these values. And again, if I'm not connected to the work network, obviously I can't do the authentication, but I probably couldn't access these resources anyway. So let's see this. Let's actually look at what this looks like. So what I have over here, so this is my Azure AD-joined machine. And what we can see very clearly is if I go to my settings, accounts, access, work, or school, we can see I am connected to Azure AD. I am not connected to a regular Active Directory domain services. This is not hybrid joined. This is just Azure AD joined. And to prove this, if I do a dsreg cmd/status, and if we go all the way up, we can see, if I keep scrolling, here we go. So Azure AD joined, yes, this machine is. Is it domain joined? No, it is not. So all I have here is an Azure AD joined machine. We can see details of my Azure AD, my user state, my single sign-on state. So yes, I have an Azure AD primary refresh token. That's fantastic. That's exactly what I want. And so this machine has no visibility to Active Directory. It's not joined, sorry, not visibility. It is not joined to my Active Directory. And I can see that as well. So if I just open up Active Directory users and computers, if I was to now go and look at, hey, any computers I have, notice it is not there. If I look at my host name, it's demo VM. There's no demo VM there. I'm not hiding it. This is my Windows 365 boxes. It's not in Cloudy. That's a user. I'm not hiding it in anything else. It has no user object. But this machine does have a line of sight to my domain controller. And what I can do here is if I do a K-list, so this is going to look at my Kerberos tickets, we'll see a few interesting things. Now, you're going to see some extra tickets because I also have the Azure AD Kerberos enabled, which is currently in preview, completely nothing to do with this whatsoever, but that's why you might see some kind of extra tickets. But the one I want you to pay attention to is the fact that, hey, look, I have this Kerberos ticket granting ticket, and the KDC it spoke to was my on-premises domain controller. So I've gone ahead and got a ticket from my Active Directory. And that's different from, you can see this other one, which was this Azure AD KRBTGT service. But without doing anything special, I got a ticket granting ticket from my regular AD. And from that, you can then see, oh, hey, look, GIFs for SMB. I got that as well from my on-premises. I also got an LDAP ticket. So for different purposes, I've got a number of different tickets. And so I can now go and access things that trust AD. And in fact, I've already demoed it because notice I fired up Active Directory users and computers for my on-premises domain. It just worked. Didn't have to enter a credential. It just worked. I could go and change domain controller to a different domain controller. It just works. I'm not doing anything special, but because it's part of that authentication, I'm getting that ticket granting ticket. You notice now I've got some extra ones. Because I went and changed domain controller, it went and did some additional communication with some other services. So I actually got 2 more tickets. So now you can see, notice my server, I've got a new LDAP session ticket for LDAP here. So I could go and talk to this domain controller, also talk to its SMB. So I'm just going ahead and getting tickets as needed completely seamlessly as I'm looking at different types of resource. I can also really do anything else. There's no limitations on this KRBTGT flow. So if I did, let's say over here, let's run, and I'm just going to access an SMB file share. Now, the important thing to notice about this machine does not have the default DNS suffix of saviltech.net. So I can't just type the name. I have to add in the .saviltech.net. But if you were doing a point-to-site VPN, normally those things will kind of get handled for you. But I'm going to go and access a file share. And it just worked. That's a different server. And then I can go and look at the things. Oh, there's the animated John. There's no prizes for seeing the mini John in this video. It's pretty blatant. It's right there. But we can see I have access to those various things. Again, it's just working behind the scenes to access those services. And that's it. There's really nothing special that I have to do. But it's important to realize this is going to happen behind the scenes. Map shares using SMB, connect to printers, access web servers. Again, as long as it's using that Windows integrated authentication, which is a requirement, I can do things. I can manage the domain. You saw me doing that. Now, if I'm using password lists, there are a few special considerations. If we actually jump over for a second, and I've got the link in the description below, there are some extra resources to pay attention to making this work if I'm using kind of FIDO2, hybrid key trust, certificate trust. So there are a few extra little steps. And again, that's in the description to go and look at those. But that's it. This thing is just going to work for you. So the key point, Azure AD Connect is synchronizing. It has to be a user account synchronized from Azure, from Active Directory domain services. It cannot be a cloud user account because, well, there's no user in the Active Directory domain services database, so how can it get a ticket for it? There's no way that's going to work. So I have to be authenticating against the user that was synchronized from AD. And at the point in time I'm trying to access that AD trusting resource, I have to be connected to a network that's going to let me have that DNS resolution, and I have to have a line of sight to a domain controller. And then what it's going to let me do is, well then, yeah, great. Hey, I want to talk to this SMB file share. I've got that KRBTGT ticket granting ticket. I'll go and talk to AD and say, hey, I need a service ticket to talk to this SMB file server. It will give me the service ticket, and then absolutely, I'll be able to go and talk to that. And I'll be a very happy user with no hair, obviously. But that's it. Remember, your machine is not authenticating. So if you do have services that require the machine to be known, the machine to authenticate, it's not going to work. This is based around the user. But that was it. Again, it means I don't have to do things like hybrid join. I can still get a fantastic seamless experience for my users if I do have that requirement to talk to on-premises resources. So as always, I really hope this was useful. Until the next video, take care.